Baie welkom by Fokus. Dis die laaste Sondag van Mei en ons is ouer gewoonte op ons pos genaamd. Ek is Lenet Francis. Vandag praat ons oor rasisme, diskriminasie en vooroordele. Die regering se wetsontwerp, die nasionale plan van aksie om rasisme, rassediskriminasie, xenofobie en verwante onverdraagsaamheid te bestry, is in Februarie bekendgestel. Die publiek het nou die geleentheid om kommentaar te lewer. Nou die doel van die plan is om 'n beleidsraamwerk daar te stel om al hierdie vorme van diskriminasie en onverdraagsaamheid op privaat en openbare vlak hok te slaan. Maar kan dit werk? En wat behels die plan? Ons praat nou met Danelien Fransman, die hoofdirekteur van deelnemende demokrasie en maatskaplike geregtigheid by die Departement van Justisie en Grondwetlike Ontwikkeling, dan ook met Nisha Balton, die uitvoerende direkteur van die Ahmed Kathrada Stichting en met Dr. Teens Elof, die voorsitter van die F.W. de Klerk Stichting. Goeienaand, baie dankie vir julle tyd.
Goeienaand, Lenet.
Why do we suddenly see this flare-up of racial incidents or this kind of outpouring of hatred, bitterness, anger that we've seen since the start of 2016?
Yes, Lynette, I think definitely we've seen it on social media, in news, covering incidents happening at university and social media. I don't think that these things have not happened before. I think in a way it's actually a good thing that people are becoming more aware and conscious of, how wrong it is and the road that lies ahead to deal with these issues. So I think we do have a long way to go to deal with all of these scourges, but I think discussion, engagement and bringing these issues out in the public is actually quite a healthy thing.
Maar dis nie die eerste keer wat ons oor rasisme praat nie. Ons het al in 2001 'n Durban konferensie gehad waar ons gesê het die regering, openbare sektor, burgerlikes gaan nou saamspan. Ons gaan nou hierdie ewel uitdryf. 2014 het ons weer gesê ons gaan iets omtrent dit doen, die inisiatief veral in sport. Dis 2016. Wat het ons nou al gedoen?
En ek dink ons het baie gedoen. Ek dink as jy kyk na die Instituut vir Rasseverhouding se onlangse verslag oor wat op die grond aangaan, dan dink ek mens moet sê dat dit is nie so erg as wat dit is nie. Dit is erg en ek sal nou iets oor rasisme sê. Maar dat ek sou sê, is moeilik om te sê 85-90% van Suid-Afrikaners lewe in vrede en goedgunstig met mekaar saam. Ek dink daar's 3 redes. Die eerste is as dit ekonomies swaar gaan, dan maak mense in mekaar. Ek sê nie rasisme sou nie gebeur het nie, was nie daar nie soos Danelien gesê het nie. Maar ek dink dit kom na die oppervlak makliker as mense swaar kry ekonomies. Tweede rede is ek dink die meerderheid Suid-Afrikaners is nie tevrede met die sosio-ekonomiese vordering wat gemaak is met die lewensomstandighede. En daarom sê hulle dis die rede dat dit nie gebeur het nie en dit nie gebeur nie is basies die vorige maghebers se skuld, dis die wit mense se skuld en hulle is rasiste. En natuurlik hierdie interessante ding dat hulle sê net wit mense kan rasiste wees want net hulle is in power, net hulle is in mag. En dan dink ek moet ons ook sê dat die mate van wit rasisme wat voorkom, wat soms oorblyfsels is nog van die ou Suid-Afrika, word ook 'n bietjie, ek dink, geïntensifiseer deur 'n gevoel van ontmagtiging ook in die minderheidsgemeenskappe. Nie net onder wit mense nie, ek dink ook bruin mense. So, ek dink daar's eksterne goed, maar ek dink dit is nie 'n verskoning daarvan. Ek dink rasisme, niemand, in ieder geval vanaand hier nie, en nie wat daar buite behoort te sê rasisme is verskoonbaar nie. Ek dink dit is verkeerd, dit moet met wortel en tak uitgeroei word. Ek dink die vraag is hoe doen mense dit? En dit is miskien die vraag wat ons verder moet oor praat.
Nisha, I'm sure you want to comment to what Professor Elof said, but I want to get back to the gains that we did make. Is that completely lost now?
No, I don't think it's completely lost, but I don't think we must take it for granted. I think that there's a greater awareness amongst people today in terms of their rights and responsibilities. And there's a lot that we might have tolerated 20 years ago that people won't tolerate today. And I think that therefore issues of racism today, whether it's small or big, will find expression both for and against and huge outrage against it on social media and all other kinds of platforms. Simply because I think people have reached a high degree of awareness of what they will and won't tolerate, both in the private and the public sphere. So I think in terms of our gains, we've certainly got a whole range of institutions in place to promote democracy. I think their ability to reach wide numbers of people is still limited. We've started certain processes in our schools and other public institutions. Those need to be strengthened significantly. And I think more importantly today, the discussion on racism has been sustained for the last 18 months. I think this is the longest period that we've had a sustained discussion on racism ever since 2001, and that, I think, is what the country needs. The plan, I think, is what we will come to now, affords us the opportunity to structure that discussion, which I think is something that all South Africans now need to grab and participate in meaningfully.
So this National Action Plan, what does it entail? Does it specify the how we're going to address it? Or is it beautiful in paper, but really without substance?
Thanks for that, Lynette. As Nishan has said, the National Action Plan is actually, it's a national initiative in response to our international obligations. So the Department of Justice, for example, has been tasked by Cabinet to lead the development, finalisation and the implementation of the National Action Plan. It is currently in a draft form. It was taken to Cabinet end of last year, and Cabinet then gave approval for this draft plan to be taken out for public consultation. I must also add that the development of the plan, the draft that we have now, is not a government product. We were very sure to work with a number of partners, some of them from civil society, like the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, the Foundation for Human Rights, Nelson Mandela Foundation and others, as well as Chapter 9 institutions, other government departments, and more recently we've also seen an interest from private sector, sports bodies and others. So the plan is also not intended to replace existing policies, programs and legislation that we have in place, but it is actually based and grounded on those, and it reinforces that. And the intention of this draft plan is to provide a public policy framework to address all these different forms of discrimination, as the title says, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and all other forms of related intolerance. And within that, for example, it includes discrimination based on nationality, age, disability, and so forth. Your question about, I think, ultimately, will it be effective? So one of the things that we have ensured is also to look at international practice. We've done a bit of a comparative research and seen what works and what does not work. And recently, in 2014, the UN published some guidelines just looking at what are best practices. And one of the things that these guidelines says, for example, is that the action plan itself must be action-oriented. It must be based on realistic objectives and achievable goals. And I think that is what we would like to emphasize now, that the development of the plan will really depend on the buy-in and support of all different sectors, not just government, but media, private sector, and faith-based organizations and the rest. So really it is dependent on a multi-sectoral approach and also support. And I think that is what we are trying to achieve up until the end of June, getting comments and inputs.
So na die breek kan ons 'n bietjie gesels oor die vleis van hierdie plan, die raamwerk, die voorgestelde raamwerk sal ons net na die breek bespreek. Moenie weggaan nie. Ons is nou terug.
Wat reg sê, en ek dink noodsaaklik sê, ons het die hele samelewing nodig om hierdie saak aan te pak. En jy moet ook seker maak dat die hele samelewing die nut sal sien daarvan om rasisme te vilifiseer. Jy weet, heeltemal te demoniseer omtrent. So ek dink as 'n Marite, maar ek dink ons moet kyk hoe gaan dit geïmplementeer word.
But the critics always say, can you have policy to regulate or to guard racist thinking or racist actions or racist thought? How can policy help people to create a society tolerant and accepted of everybody?
Well, the plan is not really policy. I think what this plan will do will point to a number of policy areas that could possibly contribute to tackling racism. But the plan is more than policy. If you look at the Australian National Action Plan, for example, or the Canadian one, I think that there's very useful examples of what the broad range of actors in society can do. And that should be the strength of a plan that we must work towards, one that identifies roles and responsibilities for all sectors of society. If this plan ends up being a government-owned and driven project, then it will fail. Mm-hmm. And we must also be mindful that we we were meant to have started this work after 2001. It took 14 years to get to a draft form. And that on its own raises its own problems about how serious we were up until this point in time. But we are at a point now where there is a draft on the table, which I think and requires that all South Africans who think that racism is a fundamental problem in this country need to make their contributions about how it can actually be tackled. I think Dannelien and the drafters and cabinet will have to indicate how all of these inputs are going to be taken into account. Because my fear is that if we end up with a plan that is solely owned and driven by government, and not government as a player amongst many, then it will fail. So, but it's beyond policy. It will have policy directives and policy prescripts, but should also begin to identify actions that we can take across society, and should also have the tools by which we will begin to measure progress in terms of tackling this.
Well, let's talk to that, the concerns and the thinking behind it, of how it's going to be managed and collated.
Okay. Well, as I said, at this point in time, we are in the process of collating the inputs up until the 30th of June. Following that process, there will be a process of collating, and we have a structure called the National Action Plan Steering Committee that was established some years ago, actually, and it is currently the structure which is guiding and assisting the department to ensure that inputs from stakeholders are, collated and considered. But going forward, I think the steering committee had its role to play during the development phase. But as we finalize the plan, we will still be working with those stakeholders to make sure, that it is aligned to, for example, existing policy like the National Development Plan, different government outcomes, and grounded in the Constitution. And this document, once we have adapted, let's call it that, the current draft following the public consultation process, it will again go through a rigorous process of clusters within government and back to cabinet for approval. And subject to cabinet approval, the document will then get deposited to the UN. And also to mention that during the next phase of implementation, following finalization, we have also seriously looked at the monitoring and implementation mechanisms. And the draft plan, as it stands at the moment, proposes a number of different options. We're calling it at the moment a coordinating structure, also a representative structure from comprising different stakeholders that will then ensure that it does what it sets out to achieve and monitors it.
Ons gaan nou 'n bietjie kommentaar daarop kry. Ons gaste praat net hierna verder oor die kollektiewe pogings wat ons moet aanwend om rasisme en xenofobie in ons land te bekamp. Moenie weggaan nie. Ons het ons gesprek voort met ons gaste, Dannelien Fransman van die Departement van Justisie en Grondwetlike Ontwikkeling, Nishan Balton van die Ahmed Kathrada Stichting en Dr. Teens Elof van die F.W. de Klerk Stichting. Maar wat kan Suid-Afrikaners doen om mense se gesindheid te verander? Jy het vroeër gesê jy kry die gevoel die plan is bietjie te wyd. Ek wil weet hoe prakties is van hierdie voorstelle. Of wag ons nou eers dat ons eers nog 14 jaar moet sit voor ons daarby uitkom?
Nee, ek dink dit lyk my daar's 'n proses op pad en daar's spertye en ek dink daar gaan 'n uiteindelike implementeerbare plan op die tafel wees. Ek wil twee opmerkings maak. Die een is daar's 'n ou gesegde, you can't legislate morality. En ek dink ons moet aanvaar dat selfs as daar kriminalisering van sekere optrede kom, dan gaan dit nog nie die probleem oplos nie. Ek is half in twee geskeer daaroor. Aan die een kant voel ek you can't legislate morality en aan die ander kant is dit nodig om sekere sterk sanksies te stuur. Jy weet, so, en die een ding wat dit vir my sal doen is die howe sal dan kyk wie is almal die rasiste, dat dit nie net een groep is nie. Maar die praktiese ding wat ek aan gedink het, ek was betrokke in die vroeë 90 jare by die vredesproses. En die van ons wat oud genoeg is sal onthou dat daar 'n hele struktuur gekom het van die vredesproses afwaarts op die grond. Daar was letterlik in elke dorp 'n vredeskomitee, peace committee, wat al die akteurs, al die stakeholders met mekaar gehad het. En ek wonder of hierdie proses nie baie goed kan werk, as mens soort van 'n groot proses het wat loop na 'n versoening, anti-rasisme, maar regtig dan nasionaal. Net soos Nishan gesê, nie net die regering, nou gaan dit werk nie. En dat mense uiteindelik die goed vestig op die grond, waar die mense wat uiteindelik elke dag mekaar praat en wat dalk rassisties teenoor mekaar voel, die sake kan uitpraat en uitspook. Dis dalk 'n manier om dit te doen.
What do we do in the meantime?
No, I think that Jens is right, but that work has started. The Mandela and the Kathrada Foundations initiated the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa. One, because we did an assessment of South Africa's capacity to deal with racism. We looked at existing institutions, and what we basically discovered was that there were less than half a dozen organizations dedicated to dealing with racism at all different levels. We then started the formation of a national network. It's in its formative stages. This year, for the first time in the history of the country, you had a National Anti-Racism Week, March 14 to 21st. And we have since then launched chapters of this network in Durban, Cape Town, Bloemfontein, Kwakwa recently. And we think that within the next 2 years, we'll probably cover all the major towns and cities. Because the view there is that you need organizations on the ground with the capacity to understand the issues, to provide the necessary leadership when issues emerge, and as well as to do the ongoing work around education, training, and development. And with or without a plan, that work will take place and will continue. The plan, I think, will give us focus areas as to how to implement certain aspects of anti-racism, as well as to know who to hold accountable for what. But with or without a national action plan, racism will have to be countered at a grassroots level. And I think that we are working towards that, but it's at a very, very formative stage at this point in time.
What advice do you have for some of our viewers who's sitting in very small communities or very rural areas who find that I want to make a contribution where I am in my dorp? I sien ek hier so ons praat nie genoeg met mekaar nie. How do you steer that? How do you start that? How do you initiate that?
We've initiated, at least through the various faith-based institutions, through various educational institutions, and hopefully by the end of the year, a whole range of legal practitioners across the country who would be able to offer the kind of support to start the initial dialogues. So 2 nights ago, we were last week we were in Kwakwa. Now in Kwakwa, we brought together people from Bethlehem to Harrismith and all kinds of places. And there's a steering committee that has been set up. We would need, whoever has an interest in wanting to start an initiative, get hold of the Anti-Racism Network. Our website is available, the contact details are there, and we will then work with people to bring together like-minded people in a locality to start the initial discussions. Because in every area, we think that there are people who would want to be involved in anti-racism work, and we can help to facilitate that ourselves, the various partners to answer itself, the Department of Justice, and everybody else will jump in to start an initiative. Ultimately, it must be community-owned, community-driven, which nationally we can then support in whatever way is required.
Ek vra spesifiek dit teens want ek kry die indruk soms voel gemeenskappe magteloos asof dit daar gebeur, maar wat kan ek doen of ons is net aan die ontvang kan in hierdie werk aksieplan praat hulle van spesiale klem op prioriteitsgroepe byvoorbeeld, want al gaan hierdie aksieplan aan die gang, is die mense nog steeds kwesbaar, hulle word nog steeds blootgestel. Wat moet met hulle, wat van hulle?
Ek dink dis 'n goeie punt dat as daar reeds inisiatiewe is, kom ons hak daarbey aan. Ek dink natuurlik die kerke en die ander geloofsgroepe is die grootste gemeene deler oral. As ons sê byvoorbeeld 80% Christene in die land, dan is daar Christene wit en swart, bruin, pink en pers wat mekaar moet en kan praat. En ek dink dit is baie belangrik dat dit nie 'n ideologiese stroom is. Ek wil dit amper so stel, die meerderheid van Suid-Afrikaners sê die minderhede is die rassiste, hulle moet dus die minderhede betrek by hierdie aksies, anders gaan dit nie werk nie.
Ja. Tot wanneer het ons nog tyd om kommentaar te lewer, Danelie?
Lenet, op die oomblik tot die 30ste Junie hierdie jaar. But we have also a plan in this coming month of June to have in each of the 9 provinces a consultation process, which is quite important so that we can get the inputs and comments from all different sectors and stakeholders. And again, to invite people to send the comments to our email address on our website. Also, if they would like to contact us, via the Justice Mail, that's great. But that would be the way forward for now.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. Ek waardeer julle gesprek. Dankie. Soos Danelien gesê het, die publiek het nog tot 30 Junie vanjaar geleentheid om voorstelle te maak of kommentaar te lewer op die voorgestelde aksieplan. Maak werk daarvan. Jy kan per e-pos gestuur aan NAP, dis nap@justice.gov.za, dis nap@justice.gov.za. En net voor ons groet, eers gou 'n regstelling. Fokus het verlede Sondag berig dat die 47-jarige Naim Desai, wat in die noordelike gebiede van Port Elizabeth doodgeskiet is, die stiefbroer van 'n bekende islamitiese leier in die gebied was. Hy was die broer. Ons vra om verskoning indien dit enige ongemaklikheid of ongerief geskep het. Nou as jy weer na vanaand se program wil luister, die program is later die week ook op YouTube beskikbaar. Soek net onder Fokus, SABC 2 en vandag se datum. Maar soos altyd nooi ons jou om terug te praat. Stuur gerus jou kommentaar, jou tweets en jou voorstelle. Skryf net die woord Fokus gevolg deur 'n kort boodskap. SMS dit na 34444. 'n SMS kos R2. Of word 'n lid van ons Fokusgroep op Facebook en volg ons ook op Twitter by FokusZA. Van al ons gaste hier in Johannesburg tot volgende Sondag aan, weer om 6:30 en net hier op SABC 2. Hoop jy 'n goeie week. Totsiens.